and I'm at Primary Source in Watertown. I want to tell you briefly about Primary Source. We support globally minded teachers to bring global content and perspectives to their schools. We provide annually about professional development opportunities for about 2,500 teachers. And these opportunities include online webinars and courses, in-person courses and summer institutes, and study tours. We also develop with teachers curriculum and other resources for uses in school. And I encourage you to look at our website if you're interested in seeing some of these. We also have a physical library located here in Watertown. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to just quickly go over the format of today's presentation. Carl Friday will speak for approximately 30 minutes, and then we will have from 20 to 30 minutes for questions and answers. You have two options in how to ask questions. One is to type a question into the chat box, in which case I will try to read it or summarize it for Carl to answer. Alternatively, you can raise your hand and we will call on you and you can ask your question directly to Carl. Now let me introduce our presenter for today. We're very fortunate to have Carl Friday with us. He's presently a professor at Saitama University in Japan, and he was formerly director of the IES Center in Tokyo. And prior to that, he was a professor of history at the University of Georgia. He's the author of numerous works on Japan, including the book First Samurai, and he's also published numerous articles. The one I want to particularly mention is called Once and Future Warriors, the Samurai in Japanese History, which is published in an issue of Education About Asia, which is available online. So Carl, I want to thank you again for agreeing to share your knowledge and your insights with this group of teachers, and we look forward to hearing from you further.
All right, thank you, Peter. Can everybody hear me okay? Any problems? Okay, good. Don't always trust technology here. Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you and for that great introduction. I'm not sure how much knowledge or insight I actually have into much of anything. You can ask my wife's opinion on that and get a different perspective as well. But anyway, I thought what we would talk about today, wanted to compare and contrast medieval Europe, which is an obvious thing to do. The knights of medieval Europe and the samurai of medieval Japan, between them constitute probably the two most, certainly if not the two most, two of the most celebrated warrior traditions in world history. And they kind of beg comparison. There are obvious similarities there. Privatization and professionalization of war making, the elite status of men-at-arms in both places, the central importance of mounted warriors. But they're also, and those sorts of things have caught the attention of scholars on both sides of the Pacific forever. For as long as there's been interaction, people have been commenting on that. But what's maybe a little bit less obvious is that there are also some very fundamental differences, and these are the things that scholars for the last 20, 30 years have really been pointing out. Origins are both very different. They have both had very different roles in society at different times. Technology, very, very different. Socio-political circumstances, very different for the two. And also the tactical and ethical traditions of these two warrior orders were quite different. So I thought what I would do today, rather than try to do some sort of broad survey or overview of history comparing knights and samurai, which would be rather dull and probably awfully confusing, since we're talking about an awful lot of history and an awful lot of change over time here to try to summarize in half an hour or so. Instead, I thought I would focus on one period and one topic here, which is to say the cultures of war of both the knights and the samurai, and to focus on the mid-10th century through the early 14th century. The reason for that is that that period represents the formative ages for both traditions. The rules that were set during that period largely shaped, in one way or another, warfare in both traditions ever since. In fact, European rules have become, for lack of a better word for this, universalized in modern times. And there's a tendency, I think, for modern, at least Western audiences, to think of them as natural and universal rules of war, but they're clearly not. So I want to use these European developments as a kind of foil to illustrate the Japanese rules and where they came from, and to speculate a little bit about why it is that Japanese customs for war differed so dramatically from those of early medieval Europe. I also want to then talk a little bit about how and why early medieval Japanese customs for war differed from those of medieval Europe. And I think the comparison there does a pretty good job of highlighting how different the worlds of early medieval Europe were from those of that of early medieval Japan. So let's see if we can get this to work right. There we go. Yeah. So let me start off with what I hope is a not terribly controversial proposition, and that is that warfare, that is armed conflict between organized bands or bodies, is probably a ubiquitous phenomenon in human society. But war, per se, is not a universal construct. The meaning of war is highly particularized to specific times and places. And like any other human activity, war takes its meaning from the social and cultural and the political context in which it takes place. Michael Walzer has a famous line about war as a social creation, and I think that summarizes the issue pretty well. People decide what war is and what it isn't. The ideas about who can fight, when they can fight, how they can fight are fundamental to the very construct of war itself, and that varies from place to place and from time to time. So traditional Western military theorists distinguish between two kinds of rules of war. The first being those that govern the reasons for fighting, called just war, or jus in bellum, if you prefer the fancy Latin. And then the second one, then, those that govern the way wars are fought, called justice in war, or in traditional terms, jus in bello. So I want to talk a little bit about Japanese takes on both kinds of rules today. All right, so Japan really generated little or no explicit literature or discussion of its own on what justified the state to use military power. Instead, it drew the philosophical base it needed from Chinese principles. Chinese ideas about war were carried into Japan along with other bits of sinology over the course of the 6th and 7th centuries, and they provided the framework for the military institutions of the Ritsuryo, or imperial state codes, that form the foundation of the imperial state polity that comes into play from the early 700s and basically for the rest of Japanese history in one form or another. So following the Chinese model then, the Japanese court viewed warfare with foreign powers and peoples as essentially an extension of domestic law enforcement. There wasn't a real distinction drawn there. It's it's actually a fairly modern distinction anyway. But in any case, the Chinese and Japanese state justified warfare in this sense. The recourse to arms then was just, with a capital J, when and only when it was sanctioned by the state in advance. The principle that final authority and formal control rested with the central government was a key feature of Japan's military and police system from the late 7th century until at least the mid-14th. The state jealously and fairly successfully guarded its exclusive right to sanction the use of force. So Japanese law posited an unambiguous distinction between, on the one hand, lawful public military action, in which one or more of the parties involved had a legal warrant, and on the other hand, unlawful private fights. And this is a position that you see very clearly in the edicts of both the court and both of the first two shogunates as well throughout this period. Unfortunately, the picture that I'm suggesting here is a little bit simplistic, because it is clear that, legalities notwithstanding, the samurai did in fact engage in fighting outside the parameters of state sanction. It's also clear that they were doing this right from the beginning of their history, and much more importantly for our purposes here, that they felt morally justified in doing that. There are a number of reasons for this sort of fighting, which government documents describe as private war, or shisen. These range from involvement in the political intrigues of the upper court aristocracy to matters of personal or family honor, even in some cases overt attempts at self-aggrandizement by force. Those are actually not as common as you would think in the early medieval period. That didn't really become a factor until the 1500s, really the 1500s and onward. In any case, samurai did clearly engage in what the state called private warfare, with growing frequency and with more and more impunity over the course of the period. But it's also clear that this represented not a broadening of central government acceptance of private warfare, but rather simply a shrinking ability to stop it. And in this respect, the legal status of feuds and duels in early medieval Japan differed markedly from the situation in early medieval Europe. I'll come back to that in just a little bit. But the proliferation of private warfare in early medieval Japan was essentially symptomatic of fundamental change in Japanese definitions of just warfare, which meant that courtier values were being replaced by those that were fashioned by the samurai themselves. The former, court values, focused pretty narrowly on central government sanction. The latter, samurai values, also embraced rather broadly the right of warriors to fight on the personal authority of patrons, whether they were samurai superiors or court superiors, as well as in pursuit or defense of matters of honor and even private profit. But by this time, or the time that private warfare was really becoming uncontrollable, the core precepts governing just warfare, that is, the rules of combat among samurai, had already been very well established. And they were created, and this is the point that I want to emphasize here, they were created in an environment that defined just war in terms of law enforcement and the pursuit of criminals. And this had really important effects on samurai notions of legitimate targets and tactics, and it produced a culture of war very different from the one that evolved in medieval Europe, and which became the foundation for modern Western ideas about what constitutes proper rules of war, just warfare. Well, I think it probably, probably goes without saying that a lot of the chivalry that we now celebrate was considerably more idealized than real. But it's nevertheless undeniable that there were codes of war operating in medieval European warfare from fairly early on, and that these provided the framework for later Western ideas about the rules of war. Chivalry in Europe was shaped in part by the values and politics of the church, but it was primarily designed by and for the aristocratic knights who actually fought. And it reflected their sense of themselves as professional fighting men, a body of custom concerned with primarily with regulating the profits of war and mitigating the consequences. Now, for the most part, these rules were not written law, and they lacked the force of law, so they were not enforceable in any judicial sense. But they did become generally accepted, even if not universally accepted, through frequent repetition, and also because of their innate practical value to the knights involved. The application and observation of these customs of war depended then first and foremost on the pragmatic advantages of observing them, and then second on the dictates of honor and reputation. That is to say, nobody wanted to be known as someone who didn't follow the rules. Okay, so let's look at some of these on both sides here. In both medieval Japan and in Europe, honor and reputation were at the heart of warriors' self-perception, and they provided the context for evaluating warrior behavior. A samurai's reputation and his honor and pride and such were almost tangible entities. They took precedence over virtually all other obligations. Slights to reputation or honor were often catalysts to bloodshed. You can also find examples of warriors who, in order to protect their reputations, would refuse orders from superiors, risk the loss of valuable retainers, murder men who had saved their lives, even sacrifice their own lives. Even one's own life and family were less important ultimately than reputation. But, and this is a very big but, we need to be, and particularly important I think for us as teachers, we need to be extremely careful about making anachronistic or ethnocentric assumptions about what honor means, or about the sort of battlefield conduct that it might be expected to produce. The idea of honor per se may, in one sense or another, be in fact a universal notion. And in day-to-day discourse, I think we too often tend to act as if it were transcendent, as if it's universal and timeless. But it's clearly not. It's universal only in its value. That is to say, I think you can make a good argument that virtually all cultures, at pretty much any time and any place, have some notion that we could translate as honor, and a feeling that it's important. But the specifics of what behaviors are and aren't considered honorable clearly vary dramatically in some cases across time and space. They're very specific to each when and where. Now, Japanese concepts of honor were pretty complex. What people are talking about when they speak of samurai honor is really a constellation of related ideas that varied a lot over time. No single word for honor, in fact, that you can actually pick out. The vocabulary is different from generation to generation, century to century. And so we're creating, by even talking about Japanese samurai honor, we're creating an anachronistic and artificial concept. But be that as it may, I'm going to do it anyway. So early medieval Japanese concepts of warrior honor and of honorable conduct in war were in fact pretty flexible. The concepts of honor and shame were central to the self-perception of early warriors, but a warrior's honor turned on his military reputation primarily, which in turn, of course, turned first and foremost on his record of victories. And that reality permitted successful warriors to rationalize almost any sort of behavior. So, samurai, in other words, were seldom, if ever, faced with choosing between military advantage and adherence to some sort of chivalric norm. Pragmatism, self-interest, tactical, strategic, or political advantage were always much more powerful determinants of military conventions in Japan than were abstractions like fair or unfair tactics. Okay, so one of the most important features of the European customs for battle was, of course, the rules for governing the onset of hostilities. European feudal lords saw a fundamental need to mark the transition from a state of peace to one of war. And they were uncomfortable, in general, letting the lines between the two become too blurred to distinguish. It was actually a serious matter to claim that someone had begun a feud, these are quotes actually from European documents at the time, without keeping his honor or without issuing a challenge. In Japan, though, there were no such conventions. There are a few examples in the sources, mostly in literary sources, that show warriors issuing challenges and even setting times and places for battle. But promises like this were honored, even when they were offered, were honored more in the breach than in the event. In fact, the preferred stratagem in early samurai warfare was always to catch the opponent off guard. Ambushes, night attacks, other surprise tactics were employed in the vast majority of both public and private military encounters during the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. In fact, preference for this sort of fighting is reflected even in later medieval war tales, which are glorifying early samurai behavior. Of course, building on tactics of betrayal and deception in order to secure victory wasn't by any matter of means a uniquely Japanese idea. Medieval European knights also celebrated cunning and guile and surprise and acknowledged them as fundamental elements of warfare. In fact, even in tournaments, surprise and cunning and guile were applauded. But even so, the Japanese attitude stands out here, because in Europe, betrayal and deception were allowable only within clearly defined limits. They were restricted by widely accepted conventions that were designed to regulate fighting to the mutual benefits of both sides in any struggle, and legitimate only because of loopholes that arose from the formalized rules governing oaths and truces and declarations and challenges. European knights were essentially lawyers about this sort of thing, and if you could find a way around the oath that you just taken, people said, you're very clever. If you violated outright, that would get you in very big trouble. Japanese custom, though, lacked all such qualifications. Even formal promises and truces were violated again and again with impunity, and at no apparent cost to the honor or reputation of the victors. The acceptance of both warrior and non-warrior audiences of these sorts of tactics is in fact quite striking. You find in a wide variety of sources, you find example after example of this sort of thing, but no suggestion anywhere that this kind of behavior is improper. The bottom line is that when they plotted strategy, early Japanese warriors seem, for the most part, to have concerned themselves only with the most efficient means to bring about the desired result. The ends justified pretty much any means, and the idea that certain sorts of tactics might be fair, or others were unfair, and put both of those in quotes, was really completely outside the samurai tradition. The whole concept of unfair tactics is in fact pretty much meaningless when you analyze early samurai warfare, because it simply didn't exist at the time for the principles involved. Japanese warriors just did not think in those terms. Change slides here again. Well, another, and change gears here too, another of the key components of medieval European military culture was the conventions surrounding the treatment of surrendered enemies. And these centered on the practice of ransoming captured knights back to their families in exchange for payments, usually in cash or of arms. The rule was essentially that knights were not supposed to kill other knights unless it was absolutely necessary. Custom demanded that a beaten enemy be given quarter. You could surrender before your opponent killed you. And also that prisoners were treated as gentlemen and ransomed back to their families for sums that were not beyond the family's means to pay. And captivity then became a kind of contract between knights. It's a rather weird practice. It has some precedence in ancient Greek hoplite battle, and it began to reappear in early Frankish warfare and became particularly well established by the mid-11th century. Seems to have come from two directions. One is the rapidly changing political alliances of the period, which meant that today's enemy could be tomorrow's friend, and so it doesn't necessarily pay to kill each other off. And also the shrinking geographic scale of military operations in Europe, in medieval Europe. That is to say, what your knights were looking at compared to, say, the Romans, looking at rather dramatically reduced opportunities for extensive plunder, which made it necessary for knights to find alternative ways to make war pay for itself. And thus the idea of, okay, we capture each other and sell each other back, and if I capture you, I can keep your horse and your arms, which of course are expensive and profitable. But that's the reason for it. But what made it practical, what made it workable, was a strong class consciousness among European military men. I'll come back to that in just a second. But there's also some interesting, another side to this. Japanese warriors really developed no remotely comparable procedures for dealing with prisoners, no comparable customs of quarter or capture or ransom. The fate of a captured warrior in Japan depended entirely on the particulars of his case. Warriors were sometimes executed, sometimes released, sometimes recruited into the service of their captors, sometimes treated very honorably, sometimes humiliated. The reason that captured enemy troops were looked upon so differently in Japan stems from, first of all, the self-image of early Japanese warriors, and also the nature of war itself in early medieval Japan. And in point of fact, capture was rather rare in Japanese warfare. Most prisoners that you see referred to in the sources were taken into custody as the result of surrender rather than seizure. One reason for this was probably, and this is the point of the slide here, the nature of the weapons employed by early samurai. Samurai were basically mounted warriors fighting with bow and arrow. Whereas in Europe, European knights preferred bladed weapons, and that's probably a self-reinforcing phenomenon with regard to this idea of taking prisoners, because it's very difficult to use a bow and arrow to capture someone rather than kill him. It's easier to fight somebody to a draw and end up with your lance or your sword pointed at his throat and say, okay, surrender or ask quarter or die. Much more difficult to do that when you're riding past each other shooting arrows. Another point here, though, in this is, and more fundamentally, I think, is that European feudal customs sanctioned the right to redress personal grievances through force of arms, which meant that, in effect, a lot of the fighting between Christian lords was essentially a lawsuit pursued by other means. In this situation, that sort of situation is logically very conducive to self-imposed restraints. When the belligerents in a quarrel could be satisfied by the accomplishment of more limited objectives, there's really not a lot of reason to gratuitously destroy an opponent. And on the other flip side of that, largesse can be seen easily as a function of enlightened self-interest, because what goes around comes around. And if I obey rules that say that I don't kill you, we've settled the quarrel, we can work this out in another way, I've defeated you, and then we come to terms, then I can expect somebody to do the same thing to me down the road if I lose the next fight. So the convention of ransom satisfied both the desire of knights for financial gain and their desire for long-term self-preservation. But the political structure of early medieval Japan made no allowance for the pursuit of private ends through violence. Instead, the court and later the shogunate jealously reserved for itself the exclusive right to sanction the use of armed force. Central authorities often chose to look the other way during private squabbles between warriors, but they never, ever dignified these activities with the veneer of legal respectability or acceptability. In other words, early samurai warfare was always legitimized under the rubric or the banner of criminal rather than civil law. One side in any conflict was, by definition, always acting in the name of the state, and those on the other were cast by definition as rebels or outlaw. In practice, of course, those labels could shift back and forth over the course of a long war, and you see this in the Genpei Wars of the late 1100s and the Nanboku-cho Wars of the 1300s. But in the end, warriors could justify their victory only in terms of law enforcement and defense of the polity. So that view of things defined captured or surrendered enemy warriors as criminals, and it set the parameters for dealing with them accordingly. Among other things, it meant that prisoners didn't belong to their captors. They belonged instead to the civil authority who sanctioned the military action in the first place. European chivalry, moreover, was a code of conduct for knights, that is, for noble warriors. And it served and was intended to intensify the separation of knight from the rest of society. But at the same time, it also defined a knight's obligations to other knights and to the other orders in society. Significantly, the customs that governed ransom applied only to knights and squires, that is, knight wannabes. Right? And the reason for that is because they were only practical because of this mutual recognition of status and along with that the expectation of reciprocity of treatment. A knight could offer quarter to an opponent because he could expect to receive similar treatment if the roles were reversed. But peasants and other non-knightly soldiers were outsiders to the code, and for that very reason they couldn't be trusted to reciprocate courtesy, and so they had no claim to courtesy in battle. Infantrymen, archers, miners, other non-noble troops neither gave quarter nor received it from knights, even those on their own side. In fact, there are lots of examples of knights deciding that their archers are getting in the way, or miners are getting in the way, or their foot soldiers are getting in the way, and they ride right over the top of them. Early samurai, on the other hand, had a far less developed sense of group identity and separateness than European knights did. In Europe, by the 11th century, knights formed the ruling class. Nearly all secular rulers were knights. It's not true that all knights were rulers, but all rulers were knights. Kings, counts, other feudal lords all self-consciously identified themselves as miles, members of the same ordo militaris or ordo equestris as their warrior retainers were. And this awareness of a common bond of knighthood and feelings of professional empathy created by it were enhanced by, coming from the outside, the church's efforts to define the role of knighthood in Christian society. And also, interestingly, by the institution of the tournament, which, among other things, gave knights practice in and incentive to develop skills at unseating and capturing opponents relatively unarmed. It becomes a kind of sport, where, of course, obviously you don't want to kill the opponents. Japan of this period, though, was still ruled by a civil authority, and the socioeconomic hierarchy still culminated in a civil, not a military nobility. The idea of a brotherhood of warriors, of what in Japanese terms becomes the buke, a warrior section of society, was still much more nascent than it was real. In the 10th to 12th century, warrior leaders came, in fact, from the lower and middle tiers of the court nobility, and they still looked to the center and to the civil hierarchy as their ladder to success. They fought for rewards that came in the form of rank and office, and they saw the profession of arms basically as a means to an end, a foot in the door towards civil rank and office, and or towards service in the private household organization of some high-ranked aristocrat. In this sense, it's somewhat analogous to modern Americans. The majority, at least until arguably things have changed since we've been at war for 10 years now, but for the most part, most modern Americans join the military either because you want to come through ROTC or you go into the military right out of high school, not with the idea of becoming a career soldier per se, but rather to pick up training to take back into civilian life. It's a way to pay for college. It's a way to learn to become a pilot or a mechanic or an electrician or whatever, rather than a long-term identity. And in Japan, then, the sense of warriors as a separate estate didn't really begin to emerge until fairly late in the game, 3 centuries after warriors had been around, with the advent of the first shogunate, which fairly self-consciously tried to develop this. But even then, it developed slowly. So in other words, the different purpose of war, the different weapons employed, and different samurai views of who they were and what their responsibilities to one another were and to the rest of society, all mitigated against the development of customs resembling those of quarter and ransom in Japan. Their place and function in the socio-political structure also prevented warriors from viewing battle as a sport-like activity pursued only by a particular order of sportsmen, and as well as from viewing prisoners as human booty that could be exchanged for a profit. Another interesting component of European ideas about how war should be fought is the notion that war is, or should be at least, combat between combatants. That is, that those who can't or don't fight, women, children, old men, priests, neutral tribes or states, wounded or captured soldiers, etc., are all entitled to some degree of immunity from attack. Now, this notion of non-combatants, you can define them from two directions. One would be their social function, those who by virtue of their occupation can't or don't make war, or you can define them in terms of circumstances, those who can't or aren't bearing arms rather at any given time. European notions of who can and can't be a morally accepted target or casualty of military action in fact embrace both definitions, because they were rooted in part in the medieval church's efforts to establish immunity for its property and personnel, and in part in knightly condescension, which dictated that knights should defend rather than harm the weak and the innocent. But the socio-political structure of early medieval Japan mitigated against the emergence of strong imperatives for non-combatant immunity based on either sort of definition, with the predictable result then that warrior treatment of those not directly involved in a particular fight was shaped mainly by the circumstances of the moment. In Europe, there was really only one seat of religious or spiritual authority, that is the church. That's an exaggeration, but for the most part, it's at this level, I think it's an acceptable one. But Japan contrasts very sharply here. Ecclesiastical authority in Japan was fragmented between a half dozen or so completely autonomous institutions representing different schools and sects, and maintaining a consciously controlled religious balance between themselves, something that one historian tabbed with the term a doctrinal multitude. The great temples and shrines in Japan not only competed with one another for patrons and followers, they also contended for secular power with the elite noble houses of the court. And then again, from the late 12th century on, also with the shogunate. And many of them even organized themselves along lines parallel to those of the great courthouses. More than a few also maintained private armies to police their lands, defend the grounds and personnel of the main temple, and also to enhance their political clout within the capital. Which means that the medieval Japanese religious establishment lacked a unified voice through which it was able to dictate military ethics to warriors. And it was too closely involved in secular affairs to make compelling claims that it was above or outside the secular realm, so that its lands and clergy deserved immunity or shelter from warrior activities, which is basically what the church in Europe claimed. At the same time, early medieval Japanese warriors were not in a position to look down on non-warriors as inferiors and in need of mercy and protection, because early warriors in Japan were the servants and officers of the powers that were, not the ruling order themselves, and their responsibilities were delimited accordingly. Warrior tactics in Japan, samurai tactics and ethics, also evolved in an age in which military force was employed mainly either in pursuit of criminals or in pursuit of what was classified as criminal activity, which meant that non-combatants were either accessories to criminal activity or just collateral, what the modern military calls collateral damage. And so, except under special circumstances, warriors very seldom bothered to worry about non-combatants. Okay, so let's wrap this up. I want to recap and highlight the major points here. First, that the 10th to 13th centuries represent an important epoch for military historians in both Japan and northwestern Europe. They mark the infancy and the adolescence of new military orders and new military traditions that came to dominate both the political and the martial cultures of both regions. Second, excuse me, that there are some interesting similarities between the circumstances surrounding early knightly and early samurai military traditions. And third, that there are also key differences, and that these differences explain why it is that Japanese ideas about what constitutes just warfare differ so fundamentally from the Western ones. In Europe, political sovereignty was fragmented and mutable. but religious authority was essentially monolithic. But in Japan, legal and political authority was highly centralized and relatively monolithic, but religious authority was fragmented. In Europe, warriors were the ruling class. Again, not all knights were lords or kings, but virtually all lords and kings were knights. But in Japan, warriors had only very limited political power, and even warrior leaders were just the officers and servants of higher court powers and religious powers above them. Because of that, both warriors and war itself had different identities in these two regions. Warfare in Japan was cast primarily as a function of law enforcement, while warfare in Europe was alternatively pursuit of a lawsuit by other means or pursuit of diplomacy by other means. And so in Europe, knights developed a very strong sense of identity as members of a special order of their own and took pains to distinguish themselves from the clergy and the peasantry. But in Japan, warrior class identity emerged very slowly and only much, much later. Until the 13th century, skill at arms was a means to an end, not a profession in and of itself. And warriors at most levels of the socio-political hierarchy identified themselves most closely with their non-warrior peers rather than with other warriors above or below them on the ladder. So the result of all these factors then was that samurai developed very different rules and customs governing quite a number of concerns that became central to medieval and later European thinking on or about just and proper conduct of warfare, including the three topics that I looked at today. So let me end with this. Some suggestions for further reading. If you're interested in this particular topic, the Samurai Warfare in the State book, I deal with it in a lot more detail. Hired Swords is really about the origins of a samurai, but there's some contrast with Europe there too as well. And First Samurai is my most recent monograph. That is probably the easiest reading. It's meant to be kind of a popular audience aimed book. It was done for Wiley, so, rather than an academic tone. So anyway, thank you for your time.
Okay, I hope that people will will either write or raise their hand if they would like to ask your questions directly. That would be great also. I see the first question, if knights and samurai would fight, who would win? Do you want to try to answer that, Carl?
Yeah, everybody asks that. Students always do. It's impossible to answer. It depends on what period you're talking about. It depends on the circumstances, and ultimately it depends on what two warriors you're talking about. The short answer is that the better fighter is going to win. I don't think you can identify generically one group or another as inherently superior.
Mindy also asked about whether this comparison is worth making in a secondary school classroom because of the disconnects. Do they outweigh the similarities? Yeah, it's true. I mean, you on the one hand, you step into sort of treacherous ground when you start comparing them because the differences are more important. But I think that's still worth doing. And one of the reasons for that is because it's almost impossible to avoid it. People have been comparing knights and samurai for at least 200 years, and probably going all the way back to the 16th century when the first Europeans showed up. So, it's almost impossible to duck that question. So you might as well embrace it and use it as a way to show how different the two places were, rather than what people expect that they're very, very similar. I guess a related question is this one around whether it's accurate to compare European feudalism and Japanese feudalism, or is this just too simplistic and inaccurate as even a beginning point, which you kind of just answered, which is that
Yeah, well, I mean, what they have in common, Bushido, of course, is a really, really tricky subject because, among other things, the term doesn't exist until the 20th century for all practical purposes. And there's, but I think again, you can do some interesting comparison. One of the key things to remember about Bushido, probably the most important thing, is there's no one Bushido. There are hundreds of Bushidos. Even if you use that term as a sort of generic historian's term for identifying the idea of how samurai should behave. Samurai really didn't start talking about that in any big way until the early modern period when they weren't fighting anymore. And that's true of a lot of the ideas of chivalry as well. The things that we identify most firmly with chivalry developed in Europe during the Renaissance and the very late medieval period when knights weren't, the less important knights became to warfare, the more they began to romanticize their own rules and traditions. And this is true in Japan too. They're doing slightly different things, which I don't think we really have time to get into here, but in terms of motivation. But and you end up with some similar ideas and some very different ideas, which is kind of fun to compare. So I think, yeah, you can deal with that. The one thing, though, that you really, really have to be careful about when you're dealing with Japan is that even, say, during the early modern period, you're not talking about one set of rules, where in Europe there was fairly widespread agreement on what chivalry constituted, even if it's to the extent that it's artificial. In Japan, you have lots and lots of pundits commenting on, pontificating, basically, on what it means to be a real warrior and what proper warrior behavior is, but they never agree. And I always tell my students that Bushido belongs to the same class of words as terms like patriotism or masculinity or femininity. That is, it's a quality that everybody pretty much agrees you should have, and nobody wants to be accused of not behaving warrior-like, or no woman wants to be called unfeminine, no man wants to be accused of being unmasculine, nobody wants to be accused of being unpatriotic. But if you ask 4 people exactly what that means, any one of those terms mean, you get probably 4 different answers. I mean, is femininity Marilyn Monroe, or is it Madeleine Albright or Hillary Clinton? Is Oliver North a patriot? Is Daniel Ellsberg a patriot? Is masculinity Woody Allen or Arnold Schwarzenegger or what? So then that's true of Bushido as well.
Elizabeth E. was asking about whether you have any recommendations in terms of images or clips from movies or documentaries that can be used to illustrate any of these issues.
There are a lot of good movies. I'm a big fan of using those. I don't have any recommendations off the top of my hand for particular places to go get pictures. You just kind of look for them. But 2 of the ones that I really recommend, a movie called The Twilight Samurai, which came out at about the same time as the Tom Cruise movie, The First Samurai, and it's set in almost the same period, just a little bit earlier. But it's and in fact, it actually stars one of the same actors. The star was in of Twilight Samurai was in The Last Samurai. He played the sword teacher in The Last Samurai, but a completely different view of what's going on. Last Samurai is a fun movie in the same way that John Wayne movies are fun. It has 0 historical accuracy, virtually, but it's still fun to watch. But the Twilight Samurai does a good job of showing what samurai had become by the end of the early modern period. Another movie I like to use a lot in class is called Harakiri in English, or Seppuku, the original Japanese title. And it's set basically at the beginning of the early modern period, contrasting warriors from the medieval period with warriors from the of the early modern period. It sort of collapses about 200 years of samurai evolution into one guy's lifetime. So it takes some poetic license, but it does a good job of contrasting those things.
There was also a question about whether you had saying that you'd referred to a number of primary sources, and is there any way to get some, list or of them?
There are several websites that have primary sources. The problem is there aren't a lot of primary sources that I would want to hand to high school kids because it would bore them, other than maybe literary things. There are a few translations of war tales in English that you can look at that are sort of fun to work with. Hiroaki Sato has a book called Legends of the Samurai that has a lot of primary sources. That sort of thing. I see. Yeah, Jing typed the title for Harakiri. I was about to type that in. Yeah, I think that's probably Sato's book. Legends of the Samurai is a good place to go to for fairly easy to read and a fairly interesting variety of sources on samurai.
Someone also mentioned a recent book. I know it won an award last year, The Voices of Early Modern Japan. It's a collection of, I think, primary sources.
Oh, Cognitive Boris's. Yeah, that's a very good book.
What else do people have? You need to speak up, folks. Raise your hand. Can you speak some of the female samurai?
Yeah, female samurai is an interesting issue because it has two meanings. You have women who belong to warrior houses, I guess, in one definition of female samurai, and generally speaking, they did receive martial training and such. They were expected to help defend the house at the last resort and that sort of thing. I mean, literally the house, the home. But mostly women were non-combatants. You do have a couple of very famous people. The duly noted Tomoe Gozen, for example. She's quite famous. She's mostly legendary, but from the early medieval period, you do see a few people like her that are basically literary characters that appeared during the early medieval period. Tom Conlon makes the point in somewhere or other. He's made at least in talks that I've heard of, a very good one, that those sorts of characters are probably reasonably credible, actually, for the early medieval period, because you're fighting on, in that point, the fighting is basically between guys on horseback shooting bows and arrows. And, that, unlike fighting with a lance or a sword, like they're doing in Europe, that is a technology that probably doesn't discriminate much against women, in terms of, you don't have to be big and powerful, and being smaller than your opponent is not a particular disadvantage. It doesn't take a lot of body strength, per se.
There was some question about the second film that you mentioned. I just typed one in. Is that the right film? Looks like it.
I think so. Let me scroll back up here a little bit. Harakiri, yeah. The original title is Seppuku. I think it's called Harakiri in English.
Okay. So I guess there was a question here about, is there still a strong connection to philosophies regarding war from medieval times in Japan to now?
Probably not to now, but you have some interesting connections to, say, Imperial Japan, or pre-war Japan. Certainly the context of war, what we're talking about today, the rules of war, there's some carryover there. You can make a pretty good argument that an awful lot of what we think of as wartime atrocities and things, the stuff that really catches our attention and results in a lot of criticism of Imperial Japan that went on during the Pacific War, were not particularly war crimes in terms of the Japanese tradition. Although on the other hand, having said that, I have an article actually you might want to look at on this called Bushido or Bull. It's in the history teacher back, what, 1992, something thereabouts, 94. Japan did, in fact, they never signed the Geneva Convention, but they did make public statements before the war started about their intention to abide by it. So that sort of puts them back on the hook. But I think that the vision of just warfare and such that I'm outlining here, for medieval Japan, does fit and explain some of what's going on in the Pacific War. More of it, though, of what happens there has to do with specific circumstances of the 20th century and that particular war. On the other side of that, though, the Imperial Army did make a huge effort, beginning in the late 19th century and ongoing through the end of the war, to sort of co-opt a vision of samurai ethic and samurai honor and whatever. But it's crazy, and it has almost nothing to do with the early modern visions of what samurai were about, and those in turn have very little to do with the way warriors actually behaved during the medieval period when they were fighting. So there are clear disconnects between there, and at the same time, though, you've got the Imperial Army policymakers trying to co-opt them, and build on it and say, well, see, warriors always behave this way. We're Japanese, and therefore we behave this way.
One person asked, is there any books or articles you would recommend if people are interested in knowing more about women in medieval Japan?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there on medieval Japan. Off the top of my head, I'm drawing a blank on any particular titles.
Well, if you think of something, we can send it out to people afterwards. That's fine, also.
Yeah, if you want to email me about it, I teach a whole course on women in medieval Japan, actually. I'm just not remembering any of the titles.
So we're getting near the end. I don't know if there's anything in particular you want to, follow up on in terms of this, Carl, or whether people have one or two more questions.
Nothing in particular for me. I see somebody had a question here about samurai culture and Zen. Zen is a really tricky concept you need to be careful of. Basically, it's overblown. Samurai religion, Zen is there. Other forms of Buddhism are there. And so is our, what we now call Shinto, which is indigenous things. In terms of early modern samurai culture, Neo-Confucianism is a much more important influence than Zen. In the medieval period, you see some of that, and there are a few martial traditions, martial art traditions that try to build on Zen ideas, but more of them build on other forms of Buddhism or on what we would now call Shinto ideas.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sure that people will continue to think about this, and we really appreciate you taking the time. I did want to let people know that there are 2 upcoming webinars on the Middle East if they have an interest in that topic. And also, there are lots of ways to connect with Primary Source through Facebook, through Twitter, through our website. We also have a recording of a teacher presentation on samurai and ninja to Bushido and karate, and a bibliography about Japan, which includes some one page which just deals with medieval Japan. So thank you again, Carl, and everybody who participated. I think when I asked for more questions, it was mainly because I was trying to read, and I was hoping somebody would raise their hand and speak so I could read without having to do 2 things at once. But I do appreciate all the questions that people had. This was a very active discussion. And if you have questions afterwards and you want to, to share them, please do email them to Jingjing or me. And I also want to thank Jingjing for all the support she gave today. And Jingjing, do you have anything else you want to say?
No. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight.
Okay. Goodbye, everyone, and thank you again.